Hey team, and welcome to another video in the Astrological Magical Elections video series. Unfortunately, we've kind of come to the time to where there are going to be no recommended magical elections for this next week period. And this is a time that I've kind of felt was coming for a little bit, just sort of watching how the different planetary aspects are, how the different planets are configured to one another. And as sort of the Mars and Saturn squares tighten, along with several other things that sort of render any more useful configurations unusable for one reason or another, coupled with kind of the waning moon phase that's going on through this time period, which naturally makes it a little more complicated. It's just not going to be a really great time, and that's okay. When we're working with planetary or astrological magic, we're not the ones in the driver's seat. It's really up to the planets, and we just kind of do the best with what we're given. So instead of just doing no video for this time period, I wanted to do a video talking more about like a topic or question that I get fairly often and just kind of sharing my views of that with everyone. I have kind of like a short list of kind of commonly asked questions that either viewers or clients will ask. Just in case a situation like this happens where we have a time period where we have no really recommended, no really strong magical elections. So today what I wanted to talk about was the question that I get, which is kind of to what extent does the electional chart need to be connected with the natal chart of an individual? So this question is, one, it's a really good question, something to really take into consideration when we're doing things. But it is primarily based off of the concept of rooting from sort of more general electional astrological practices. The idea is that you are, everything in this world is born or begun at a specific moment in time, and that astrological chart, which for people we would call, the natal chart, is the root chart for which everything else that kind of happens in that individual's life is connected back on in some way, shape, or form. So the general idea with like electional astrology is you want to root or connect the electional chart that you're going to use or you're suggesting being used with the natal chart for that individual. And usually this is done by repeating significant and important degrees or planetary positions. So for instance, if somebody is born with, the ascendant at 19 degrees Sagittarius, then maybe that degree is something that we utilize in an election chart. Maybe that election chart has 19 degrees Sagittarius rising, or there's an election chart with 19 degrees Sagittarius in the midheaven, or the moon in the electional chart is there, or some kind of combination with that, like some significant degrees, whether they be like the ascendant degree, the moon degree, the sun degree, whatever, get pulled back up and brought out in the electional chart to where that offered election is then, kind of taps into their natal chart to get kind of more strength from, or to be more personalized for that individual. Because, we'll have these sort of generally positive elections that maybe many people will use for different things, but it's going to hit different people differently just because it will connect with their natal chart in some significant way, to where, 3 different people utilizing the same election for, similar-ish outcomes will get different results from that based on how that election hits their natal chart. So because we're using this idea with general electional astrology, is this something that we need to be concerned about when we're making magical election? So the answer to this question is a little bit more complicated than just like a straight yes or no. I personally think it has to do a lot more with what exactly you're trying to do and sort of what magical practice or process you are working through. So I really enjoy electional astrology in general, especially reading about electional astrological practices in traditional texts, because this is like the one area where different astrologers have different kind of philosophical views. And they write about it, and they'll often like reference different arguments that some astrologers will make, and it's basically like the house system debate from like 800 AD to around 1500 AD. Like this was the thing that astrologers sort of like wrote about and argued, with one another, often separated by several centuries. Some astrologers believed in, and still today, that's not really a past tense thing, that the natal chart was more of like a hard set in stone kind of thing, to where there's this concept called like the natal promise, which is a term that classical astrologers utilize, and even traditional astrologers today or contemporary astrologers will utilize to refer to essentially what an individual can get out of or expect to manifest from their natal chart. Like having a positive second house promise can indicate somebody is going to do well with money or be financially secure, whereas a more negative second house promise could be somebody who struggles with money, has a bad relationship with money, and may literally indicate poverty. And the main idea here is that the natal chart is like a hard set in stone thing, to where electional astrology or like horary astrology cannot indicate massive upheavals essentially to the natal chart. Like what the natal chart promises is what it's going to be. There's not a whole lot we can really do about it other than sort of like manage it or mitigate any potential harm. This is to the point where some astrologers didn't even want to perform electional services for individuals who did not have a natal chart present, which is, of course, a much more common problem in history than it is today, but still can be an issue. Then we have another camp of astrologers who believed and still believe that the electional chart is an important and strong influence, but that it doesn't make sense to have this other branch of astrology, like electional astrology, if we can't use it. Like if this electional astrology practice is ineffective for individuals who have weaker, quote, nativities, then what's the point of it? So there's a little bit of a background conversation that you have to have with yourself about what you believe is the strength of the natal chart, like how much of it is cemented in fate and how much of it is a little bit more up for negotiations. And this is where kind of our question stems from, this kind of uncertainty. To what extent should you root or connect or consider your natal chart when it comes to using or making or taking advantage of magical elections? My answer to this is actually very little. I don't think it's really all that important, but there are parts of it where I think it is more important of a consideration than others. So primarily when we're working with planetary talismans is where I think it's the most important to really consider what you're electing and what you're trying to do. So usually planets will come in kind of like 3 different varieties. You'll have planets that are generally okay to use, planets that are malefic and not okay to use, and planets that are weakened and could be either, benefic or malefic in your chart and are also not good to use. So this takes more of a step back and examines the relationship between an individual and the planets in their natal chart. How well situated are certain planets in the natal chart? What areas of life do they signify and rule or are influencing? And which one of those influences are more easy to get along with, to maybe get a better relationship with? That's kind of, I think, the main focus of planetary talismans. So practically what this means is that if you are interested in a planetary talisman and you're looking at your natal chart and you're like, man, I could really use help with like relationships, that would be nice. And the ruler of your 7th house is Venus, and Venus is not doing well either, in the 8th house or square Saturn or, retrograde or combust or anything like that. Like Venus in your natal chart is not positioned in a good way. It's not strong or not, really not even like it is not strong consideration, but Venus is not favorable. The reason why you are having or experiencing relationship problems is because Venus is dysfunctional in some way in your natal chart. The kind of immediate reaction to this would be, oh, I need to get a Venus talisman and this will fix it. And it probably won't. Like I've actually seen and worked with a lot of people who have kind of done something similar and utilized talismans for certain planets in their natal charts that were not well placed, and essentially all that did was amplify the already kind of negative effects they were experiencing, because that's just what's going to happen. And so that's really what I would take into consideration when it comes to natal charts. Primarily used for planetary talismans to understand and determine the kind of relationship between the individual and the planet that they are attempting to work with, because that will change how they work with that planet. If you have a planet that is more malefic or more dysfunctional, or you're not working quite right, jumping into kind of the deep end and creating a planetary talisman for that planet is probably going to just exacerbate the problems that you're already experiencing. What you really need to do in that case is remediate, which is like a different set of practices with which a talisman can be an option. But you don't want to just kind of like hit the ground running with that, because it's just kind of make things worse. Kind of a similar story with planets that are weakened in your natal chart, usually by being cadent, retrograde, or combust the sun. They're probably going to continue to be somewhat ineffective if you get a talisman for them. You'll want to kind of dip more into like empowering rituals, which again, a talisman can be part of, but I'd actually kind of not prefer to do that until you reach a certain point where things are getting better, like objectively better in that area of life, just to kind of change what's happening there. Because the idea of astrological magic is that there's a relationship happening. Like this is kind of the part of the remediation process where you change your relationship with that planet, what it signifies, the energy of that planet, to kind of make things better or kind of move things off in a better direction. So planetary talismans I absolutely think are important to, double back to the natal chart, see what maybe is and isn't a good option, and then move forward with there. Because luckily, if you are looking for like help with a relationship issue, but your natal Venus, who is the ruler of the 7th house, isn't doing very well, then you can go on to other ideas or other things like stars, planets, and decans as other kind of parts of the celestial hierarchy to utilize, who can do similar things, but maybe without like the baggage of a planet. So what about those other ones? What about fixed stars, decans, and lunar mansions? Should we take into consideration natal placements with those? And my answer with this is generally no. I don't really think that the natal placements involved with these spirits is really that important. I think it's probably important to consider what lunar mansion your natal moon is in, because you're probably going to get better returns on that mansion because you're kind of born with an innate natal connection with it, to where you'll probably get much better success out of it. So definitely look to making talismans for your natal lunar mansion, if that's the mansion that you could potentially get use out of. My cat jumped on top of my hutch. Definitely that can be a really powerful ally that you kind of are born with an innate connection with. Fixed stars I don't really see as having a significant impact with people in the same way, primarily because fixed stars are kind of a thing that are a step beyond planets. And are a little bit more impersonal. Of course, you can have personal connections with fixed stars, whether they're connected with planets in your natal chart, or like the ascendant or midheaven or things like that. So absolutely. And it might be kind of a similar thing with lunar mansions, where if you have that connection with a star natally, then you're probably likely to get a better return on any sort of like relationship investment from that star. So definitely worth considering if you have a natal fixed star position to go and then utilize talismans for to better make use of those gifts that the star is trying to provide you with, or to help kind of rein them in and control them a little bit, because since fixed stars can be a little bit kind of unwieldy in some ways. So those are some of my thoughts and my experiences with connecting to natal placements, or to considering natal placements when making magical elections. For planetary talismans, you definitely need to take that step back and to consider what the relationship is between yourself and a planet or an area of life, based on what planet rules that house in your natal chart. And that relationship is going to be exemplified primarily by the placement of the planet in the natal chart and their condition, whether or not they're doing well, whether or not they're able to kind of produce effectively what they have signification over. Essentially, that natal relationship will tell you sort of like what you're going to get out of it, and then whatever magical practice can then alter it, or hit the gas on whatever that is. And so because you're kind of accelerating that signification, you're empowering that signification. If you already have a more difficult relationship, or if that planet already manifests in a bit more difficult ways, you're just going to get more of that, which obviously isn't what you want. That's not why you're doing this. But for planets that are more well placed, that one generally does have a positive experience with, then definitely move forward with that. Fixed stars and lunar mansions, they're a bit beyond planets in their personifications, and that generally they're not really personified very much in the tradition, so that relationship isn't as important. But there are situations where natal positions can indicate more significant relationships with certain fixed stars, either by being conjoined planets or the ascendant or midheaven, or with lunar mansions, which is going to be done primarily by the natal placement of the moon in a lunar mansion. So something to consider there, routes to take to explore that more often. But when we're talking about like literally crafting an election to root with the natal chart in the same way we would do kind of more general mundane election for like a wedding, or starting a business, or beginning some project, or taking medications, or doing like a medical procedure or anything like that, you wouldn't really handle those the same way, or I don't necessarily recommend handling them the same way. Partly for kind of a couple different reasons. The first is that magical elections already have a lot of rules to have to work around, to then like throw on top that, it has to connect to the natal chart is just like another step, like a whole extra step. But that doesn't mean that you can't do that if that's something that you want to do. So like if you're ever watching any of the magical election videos, and one of the elections that I'm showing has like an ascendant degree that's very close to like your sun or your moon, or like your natal midheaven, or maybe even as close to your natal ascendant, and if you could tweak the time to when you make that talisman or do that ritual to have the ascendant on that degree, then you absolutely should do that. Like there's no reason why you can't do that, or why you shouldn't do that. That just makes it even better. But generally you don't need that. I've had a lot of great success with talismans that are not connected to my natal chart really in any way, and the same that I've worked with other individuals and clients for as well. So you don't need it, but it's definitely something that you can utilize. I just wouldn't like make or break it in that regard. And a lot of the reason for this, in my opinion, kind of comes down to the philosophy involved with it. So I went on that whole spiel about kind of how different camps of traditional astrologers, and by traditional I mean historical astrologers, Saul, Masha Allah, Benadi, Al-Rajal, Al-Imrani, different individuals who wrote about elections, the different camps that they're in, because I think it's a great way to think about or to kind of put yourself in a box of what these individuals are trying to do and who you kind of more align with. So part of me is just trying to take into consideration that yes, the natal chart is a thing, and it generally holds with it some keys or clues about our futures and our fates and when we can expect things to happen. That's the whole point of having a natal chart. That's the whole point of astrology, really, is to understand these patterns and to help us kind of predict what's coming down the line. But we also have these other tools in astrology that I think are important, and sort of this perceived like supremacy or permanence of the natal chart is kind of an issue or conflicts with a lot of some of these techniques or branches of astrology. Like, what's the point of electing if only individuals with naturally strong elections in these areas can benefit from elections at all? Like, what's the point of that? Or just kind of like the same concept with astrological magic. The whole point of astrological magic is to affect change through magic coupled with other mundane solutions. Like, that's the whole point. If we can only utilize certain types of magic or certain types of talismans based on natal connections with no way to soften that or to change it, then why do we have this? Like, what's the point of having an astrology that is so embedded in like a hard fate system when we have these other ways of not necessarily like manipulating with, but engaging with the processes or the rules of fate, as it were, to try to affect some kind of change? Like, the whole point of astrology to me personally is to understand the rules of the game, to be able to know how to kind of play the game and to play it well. But you're not going to do that if you're just like, this is what my natal chart says and there's nothing I can do about it. So when it comes to things like astrological magic or electional astrology for more general things, I tend to view them as ways that we can renegotiate what our fates are, and how we experience different parts of our lives, because we do have some kind of agency, even if it isn't as strong as, you know, whatever our natal charts symbolize or indicate for us. You know, we need help to kind of overcome that, to which astrological magic is what, you know, that's the key for that help. So those are some of my thoughts and experiences on this topic. It's a really fascinating question that is a little bit deeper than it appears on the surface, because it requires you to kind of have this philosophical framework for astrology kind of worked out on your own. And of course there is room for disagreement, obviously. That's kind of the fun part of it as well. I'd love to hear stories about elections that you've utilized, either, you know, ones that I've shown in past videos or elections that you found and crafted for yourself. And what happened with those talismans, what the results were, whether there were any results to speak of, and, you know, what the connections or non-connections to your natal chart were that maybe helped to inform how the situation worked out. So make sure, you know, leave those stories either in the comments or in my email. And then, you know, I'll see you guys again on the Capricorn new moon, and hopefully by then some of the planets will have worked out some of their issues where we can have some more magical elections. So everybody take care, and have a happy new year.